Just a quick note for those of you who may be listening to this on our well, I should put it this way: listening later in the day. If I put up a YouTube video of this segment of the program, I am sitting here in the studio and I am holding something called a bacon burrito from an outfit called TJ. These were delivered this morning. I've had one of these already, and I've got to tell you, I never had a breakfast burrito before, and I am now sold on these things. It's also very warm. It's like having a warm cat. I guess you could put it on your lap and get the same feeling, and it wouldn't necessarily start trying to knead your clothing while it was sitting there. Which is, I've got a kitty cat that has very sharp claws, and let me tell you, that is not a pleasant experience, and you can't seem to convince them to stop doing it. It's ingrained, and you can say no, and the cat only hears whoa. You can say no again, and the cat hears whoa. Because if you say yes, the cat hears whoa, and if you say it's 7 o'clock, the cat goes whoa. That's all they hear. That's pretty much, I think, standard. We're aware of that your cat does not understand. Well, I do realize that there are certain key words you may use if you call them the same name every day, and they associate that perhaps with food or something like that. They might understand at least that word means food or me or something along those lines. But we're really getting off the beaten path. I'm not trying to avoid talking about the Clinton family this morning and its criminal activities. I'm just telling you right now. Speaking of animals, I was watching some of the convention coverage last night. Look, this is what I do for a living. A lot of you out there don't have to do it, and I'm also a political junkie. So you would think I would be hanging on every minute of it. And you know what? I said to myself, no, instead I'm going to look around and see what else is on TV. Wouldn't you know it, even with DirecTV and all of the channels that are provided, mostly channels showing you reruns of shows you saw many, many years ago, I eventually settled on something called Animal Planet, and they were showing musk oxen fighting in Russia. And I found that to be much more pleasurable than watching Bill Clinton speak last night. As a friend of mine said, unlike the Clintons, the musk ox actually smell better. 9 minutes now after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you. Top story this morning. And of course, Dr. Jonathan Tripp scheduled to join us in a while as well. He is back from a trip down south, very far down south to Nicaragua. But we'll talk about that trip a little later, probably next week sometime, because we're going to actually talk about a medical issue today with him. That's coming up just after the 8:30 break on our program. But in the meantime, Bill Clinton speaking to the masses last night, or at least to the people in the convention hall in Philadelphia, who had actually just nominated his wife a short while before. And as he was speaking, I wondered, does the man actually have any real evidence to back his claims?
You could drop her into any trouble spot. Pick one. Come back in a month, and somehow, some way, she will have made it better. That is just who she is.
And in fact, take Benghazi, for instance. A month after it happened, it was all quiet there. So I guess he's right. or when she was dodging bullets in Bosnia. Yeah. She solved the problem so well that when video of the encounter was released years later, she'd already cleaned up all of the gunshots, even in the video. Clinton went on to talk a little bit more about his wife and their wonderful relationship. I guess he figures that all the money that his foundation has collected over the last several years in exchange for favors they've promised to various special interests is going to be able to pay off the national debt once his wife is president.
There are clear, achievable, affordable responses to our challenges. But we won't get to them if America makes the wrong choice in this election.
This morning I read a column by Eric Erickson, who's a conservative writer, and he actually thinks Bill Clinton had a great speech. Of course, Erickson also says he's never going to vote for Donald Trump. On the other hand, Rachel Maddow over at MSDNC, Rachel Maddow said it was a sexist speech, and she didn't like it. Clinton, by the way, also mentioned last night that he didn't marry for looks.
I married my best friend. I was still in awe after more than 4 years of being around her at how smart and strong and loving and caring she was. And I really hoped that her choosing me and rejecting my advice to pursue her own career was a decision she would never regret.
Of course, he never mentioned at any point there that his wife was good looking. lots of other strong suits, but I'm sorry, I can't say that I ever liked looking at her. That might explain all of the other women. And then he went on to point out to the audience as well that his wife complains a lot.
If you were sitting where I'm sitting and you heard what I have heard at every dinner conversation, every lunch conversation, on every long walk, you would say, this woman has never been satisfied with the status quo in anything.
In other words, won't she shut up? Yeah, you get the idea. Telephone number to reach our program this morning, 736-0300. That's 736-0300. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. I'm here until 10 o'clock this morning, and you're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, newsradio1310.com as well online, and you're up next.
Good morning, Bill, and good morning to your radio audience, especially the people that call in and contribute to your show.
Well, yeah, that's great, but what's the point?
Last night, the Democrats put their best face forward in Bill Clinton. He endorsed his wife, who FBI Chief Comey proves she is a dangerous liar. Isn't Bill Clinton the guy who put his hand on the Bible and perjured himself, whereby he was fired and had his law license suspended?
Yeah, he's gone through a lot of what you'd call difficult times himself and generally been given the media pass, as will be his wife. And I thank you for the call because we have to point out, no matter what the FBI came up with, and I'm telling you, folks, they complain about Trump as being unethical in the media. And it may well be, but then they turn around and they celebrate Hillary. Oh, the first woman ever to be a major party nominee. Oh, women are cool. Just like they said with Barack Obama. Oh, a man of color. People who are of colors are cool. Vote for cool. Well, of course, national debt doubled in that time period, and I guess that's irrelevant to the folks in media as long as Johnny and Jimmy can go around claiming they're husband and wife, and men can walk into little girls' bathrooms and scratch themselves in front of little girls. The Democrats are all okay with that, and they want to maintain that. The fact the country is circling the drain and we're going to hell is irrelevant to them. 8:14, 61 right now, on our way into the upper 90s today. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Meanwhile, the DNC email scandal seems to be, well, as far as the media is concerned, the scandal part of it is over because it's all Russia's fault. So pay no attention to what those DNC staffers were doing, obviously who are unethical. President Obama was asked about this yesterday. And, of course, he immediately wanted to say, well, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump are the best of friends.
What I do know is that Donald Trump has repeatedly expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin.
Okay, and your own administration wanted to reset. Hillary went over there with a reset button, in fact, and gave it to him. Boy, that was impressive. I'm sure Putin went, wow, a toy reset button. Nobody's ever given me one of these before. Now, Mr. Obama didn't stop, though, and I think at one point he admitted, whether on purpose or perhaps by accident, maybe it's Freudian, that Russia has Hillary Clinton's personal emails.
I know that experts have attributed this to the Russians. What we do know is that the Russians hack our systems, not just government systems, but private systems. But what the motives were in terms of the leaks, all that, I can't say directly.
Personal and private systems get hacked. So they've got Hillary's emails and all of our state secrets. Wonderful. You're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on KLIX.
Yeah, Bill, the precedent that has been set by Bill Clinton when he stood there and lied to us with his crooked little finger and said he didn't have sex with that woman or whatever it was, and he did, and how he has brought down whatever principles that they had, any ethics, and how we've let this guy off the hook. And when he was standing there gray-faced, thinking that he was done, and then he got away with it, it was just, see, this is exactly how they have taken us to a place where we never thought we would be. And then he stands there and lectures us about their functioning family when they're the height of dysfunctionality. And you say, again, I say to myself, useful idiots. There's just way too many of them. And who the hell believes this stuff? Thanks, Bill. See you.
And thank you. Well, and useful idiots. Look at the Bernie Sanders supporters. I was reading this morning Timothy Carney, who's a writer, a conservative, and he writes for the conservative Washington Examiner, went out into the streets. Was it Carney? I'll get to this later in the show. It may have been a writer with another publication. I'll have to clarify that because I've got a stack of material here related to the Sanders group, too, as well. But the reporter went out and asked 10 Bernie Sanders folks on the streets some various questions, and it turns out they're not liberal Democrats. They're not even many of them socialists. Turns out they're communists. Now, these are the people we're dealing with, and most media has been a little shy about explaining that to all of us, likely because media believes, as do most of the Democrats and everyone to the left of Democrats, that capitalism is a failure. And they'll say, well, look, the economy, well, they tell you that the economy has improved in fits and starts because they can't tell you it's worse because you can't sell your product if you say it's not better. So they're telling you, oh, we've had a long recovery, almost 8 years. Yes. It's like saying that the snail has now made it down to the corner after leaving your house 2 years ago. It's not good. It's not progress in a sense that we're familiar with progress in this country. But on the other hand, they'd like to tell you that things aren't roaring anymore because it's capitalism's fault. And there's so much inequality in the economy. Yet if you look around, people today, I mean, before I moved to Idaho, I had 3 big flat panel TVs in my house, and they were all hooked up. My parents never had anything like that. My parents didn't have cell phones. My parents never had cable TV. We had an old rotary dial telephone on the air, and when I was a kid growing up, there was a woman at the other end of town, and she worked out of an office, and she patched the telephone calls through, like Sarah in Mayberry. That's how that worked. So we've got all of these things that even poor people have these things in this country now. And we're being told how bad off everybody is in that sense and why we need to take stuff from the producers and give it to all of them. And they don't like capitalism. They blame capitalism for what's happened. And yet they can't look around and realize it might have been the stimulus package, which, of course, just increased the debt, or the overwhelming volume of regulation that has been placed on businesses and on this economy that have slowed down innovation and business development. And we're blaming free trade at the moment for all of our woes, but we might have more businesses getting launched in this country if they could afford to do it. When a guy has to go out and open a new business, a small business, and he's told, well, or he's got to retrofit a business and spend 50 grand in order to put in a wheelchair ramp, he's just going to say, sorry, I'm going to close shop. 20 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We've got more coming up in just a few minutes. Donald Trump responds to a question from Bill O'Reilly about the minimum wage. It may shock you, maybe not, but it's interesting to hear Trump actually supports an increase. I mentioned Dr. Jonathan Tripp on the way in a few minutes. We have a discussion going on, of course, with a doctor or one of his associates every week between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, and nothing changes, of course. Do that on a weekly basis, as I say, and hope you can stick around for that today because it's good to see the doctor back, safe. He and his family. We're in a part of the world that could be described sometimes as being a wee bit dangerous. Subject we'll be discussing in about 10 minutes, and that is exhaustion from the heat, and obviously important this week, and dehydration. And we'll talk a little bit about how and where that happens to come about now and then. Donald Trump, as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Trump was on Bill O'Reilly's program last night. Who'd have thunk it? Yeah, about every night he's on Bill O'Reilly's program. The two are good friends, we should point out, longtime friends. But Bill O'Reilly was asking Mr. Trump a question about the minimum wage. Now, I want you to listen to this for a moment. I think that Trump was being hammered on some conservative websites this morning for proposing a hike in the minimum wage to $10 an hour from the current, what is it? It's $7 and some change at the moment, the federal minimum wage. But listen to Trump's response, and then I've got a couple of thoughts on this because I think in this case, Mr. Trump is being treated a bit unfairly by many conservatives in media.
You go with the states. Let the states make the determination. Because if you take New York, it's very expensive to live in New York, and they need more than $7, $8, $9. So you go with the states.
But the states have the authority now to do that. But there has to be a federal minimum wage.
They do.
What would you set the federal minimum wage
at? It doesn't have to be. Well, I would leave it and raise it somewhat. You need to help people, and I know it's not very Republican to say.
Well, give me $10.
People, but
10?
I would say 10. I would say 10.
So Bill O'Reilly puts the figure of $10 in his mouth. O'Reilly says, "Oh, we need a federal minimum wage." Who says? I mean, why do we always need to have federal control from Washington or federal decision-making from Washington? That soundbite is clipped for brevity because we don't have all morning. What Trump said afterwards, he went back to his default position. Let the states set it. And he's right. Cost of living in Twin Falls, Idaho is radically different than in New York City or San Francisco or Seattle or Portland. We all know that. Heck, I think the cost of living here is probably radically different from Boise, which brings up another interesting part about all of this. I grew up in western New York State. It was about if you got in the car and had to drive, we didn't have an interstate at the time, so if you had to drive to New York, it was about a 9-hour trip. After the interstate, I actually had only shortened it to about 8 hours, which is like driving from here to Coeur d'Alene, from what I understand. So you realize how distant that happens to be. But we were all still part of New York State. I grew up in the second smallest town in the county, or second biggest town in the county, I'll put it that way. We had about 2,000 people. Biggest town had about 5,000. Any direction you turned and threw a rock, you had about a 50-50 chance of hitting a dairy cow. The cost of living in my hometown, even though you were still paying outrageous New York State taxes, the cost of living in my hometown, where you can still buy a nice home for under $100,000, about $75,000, $80,000 will buy you one of the nicer homes in town. The cost of living there is radically different than it is even on the other side of the state, in New York City. So maybe we even break this down even more and say, no, let localities set the minimum wage. And I'll add to that, in Baltimore, a liberal city, the president of the city council has said a proposed $15 minimum wage is ridiculous because it will drive business. And he's a Democrat, business out of the city. And this is after a riot last year. Many people had to have their arms twisted to rebuild their stores after they were looted and burned. And now you want to tell them they're going to double the minimum wage? He knows what he's talking about. Finally, a liberal with a little bit of logic. You're up next. You're on the air at 8:27 on KLIX.
So I absolutely disagree with O'Reilly. You can't have minimum wage. You just need to get rid of it altogether unless you can lock down the borders and absolutely prevent any illegals from coming. You're shooting yourself in the foot. If you raise minimum wage and don't deal with illegal immigration, then you'll have a bunch of Americans, actual citizens, out of work because all of the illegals will have all of the jobs because there's no oversight over illegals because they're already breaking the law and they just turn a blind eye to it. Unless you deal with the illegals, raising the minimum wage will just bankrupt.
Unless, Mr. Kaine, who, of course, if he's the vice president, and that's a possibility, says that he and Hillary within 100 days will work to ensure that all legal and illegal immigrants become citizens, and then therefore everyone will get that big minimum wage.
Well, then it becomes obvious that their only intention is literally to bankrupt the whole country and destroy America.
Right.
No, not even to buy votes, because we won't have an America if they do that. If there's absolutely no border, I mean, we're already almost there, but if there is no border, there is no America, period.
I know, by the way, a lot of fast food restaurant owners who actually pay more than the minimum wage because they've had difficulty finding workers. So the minimum wage, and I think you make a good point, really is irrelevant. The market will set the bar.
It needs to. But if you get government regulation out of the way, it can work. If you don't, then it won't. It's just like anything else. You get government telling you have to do this or you have to do that. It eliminates competition left and right because you no longer have the little guy. You only have the big guy that can actually afford to meet all those regulations. You see it in every single industry. The little guy's dying. Truckers are dying. There are very little, if any, owner-operators operating, say, one truck. They're all operating multiple trucks because they can't afford not to. You can't make a living doing a lot of the stuff. You used to be able to make pretty good money doing that. You can't anymore because of government.
God let you go. That's a great point. Thank you for the call. We've got Better Health coming up.